History remembers its conquerors, those rare figures who bend the arc of empires to their will. Yet few have cast as long a shadow as the man who, for 16 years, held Rome itself in a grip of terror. His name echoes still across the millennia, a name that once made the mightiest republic in the ancient world tremble. Between 264 and 146 BC, two Mediterranean powers engaged in a series of conflicts that would determine the fate of the Western world. These confrontations, the Punic Wars, pitted rising Rome against established Carthage in a struggle not merely for territory or wealth, but for survival itself. Their battlefields stretched from Sicily to Spain, from North Africa to the Italian peninsula. Their armies clashed on land and sea, leaving hundreds of thousands dead in their wake. From this crucible of fire emerged legendary figures: Regulus, who chose torture and death over dishonor; Scipio, whose brilliance earned him the epithet Africanus; and towering above them all, a Carthaginian general whose military genius nearly brought Rome to ruin. His audacity in crossing the Alps with war elephants remains one of history's most astonishing feats. His tactical mastery at Cannae still features in military academies worldwide. His name became so feared that Roman mothers would quiet unruly children with whispered warnings: Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. This is the story of that man, of his sacred oath sworn in boyhood, of his relentless pursuit of vengeance against a rising empire, of brilliant victories and ultimate defeat, of a clash between civilizations that would shape the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. This is the story of Hannibal Barca and the Punic Wars, a tale of ambition and honor, of triumph and catastrophe, of a moment when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance, dependent upon the decisions of one extraordinary mind. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Carthage as a young boy observed his father prepare for conflict. This was the son of Hamilcar Barca, heir to both a legacy and a sacred oath. It was the year 237 BC, and the wounds of defeat still festered in the proud maritime city-state. The First Punic War had concluded 9 years earlier, leaving the once mighty North African power humiliated, stripped of Sicily, and burdened with crushing indemnities. The Roman Republic had emerged as more than a rival. It had become an existential threat. In the temple of Baal Hammon, where sacred fires burned eternal, the Carthaginian general placed his 9-year-old heir's small hand upon the altar. The vow the child swore there would resonate through history, never to befriend Rome. This was no juvenile promise made in ignorance. The temple's shadows seemed to deepen around the boy, as if the gods themselves leaned closer to witness this covenant. This pledge would bind the youth more surely than chains of iron, setting in motion events that would nearly bring the rising Italian power to its knees. The North African metropolis had once been the undisputed mistress of the Western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, this commercial center had grown into a maritime empire, its wealth built upon the foundations of trade rather than conquest. Purple dyes, silver, tin, ivory, and gold flowed through its harbors. Its fleet was unrivaled, its merchants legendary. Yet the Latin city's inexorable ascent had changed everything. The initial confrontation between these powers had been fought primarily at sea, an irony that still burned in Punic hearts. The infantry-focused Romans had defeated Carthage in its own element. The forfeiture of Sicily, the first and most prized province, was but the beginning. The mercenary revolt that followed had nearly destroyed the metropolis from within. Only Hamilcar's military genius had preserved his homeland from destruction. As the seasons passed and the boy matured under paternal guidance. The father sought to rebuild Carthaginian strength through a new strategy: the conquest of Iberia. The silver mines of Spain would replenish the depleted treasury. Its warriors would bolster military might. While the Senate gazed eastward toward the Hellenistic kingdoms, these Phoenician descendants would forge a new empire in the west. The young heir absorbed these lessons with uncanny aptitude. During daylight hours, he trained alongside the Numidian cavalry, learning to ride without saddle or bridle, to hurl javelins with deadly accuracy while at full gallop. As evening fell, the youth studied Greek literature and philosophy under learned tutors, developing intellectual prowess that would one day outmaneuver Rome's greatest commanders. Tragedy struck during the summer months of 229 BC. Hamilcar drowned while covering his army's retreat across the Jukar River, and leadership passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal. The adolescent continued his education in the crucible of the Iberian campaign, observing as this new leader expanded influence through diplomacy as much as military might, establishing Nova Carthago, New Carthage, as the seat of Punic power in the peninsula. The watchful Romans grew concerned. Some 3 years after Hamilcar's demise, they negotiated the Ebro Treaty with Hasdrubal, establishing that river as the northernmost boundary of Carthaginian influence. An uneasy peace prevailed, built upon foundations of mutual suspicion. Assassins claimed Hasdrubal's life as the 5th year of his command drew to a close. The expeditionary force then proclaimed the 25-year-old son of Hamilcar as their commander. These veterans saw in him his father's image, the same piercing gaze, the same natural authority. What remained invisible was the childhood oath still burning within, a promise that had shaped every aspect of his development. In the home city, the Council of Elders debated the wisdom of entrusting so much authority to such youthful hands. But the new general had already begun consolidating control over southern Iberia through lightning campaigns against restive tribes. This combination of diplomatic skill, strategic insight, and tactical brilliance silenced critics. Here emerged a new type of Punic leader, one who combined the mercantile cunning of his culture with military genius that seemed divinely inspired. The Republic watched from across the sea, not yet comprehending the gathering tempest. The Senate, preoccupied with affairs in Illyria and Macedonia, paid scant attention to reports from a distant province. They would soon learn to fear this new adversary. From atop the walls of the newly established city, the young commander gazed northward toward territories beyond the treaty boundary, his childhood vow echoing in memory. His father's spirit seemed present, urging advance. The strategic pieces aligned perfectly. Rome believed any future struggle would occur on familiar ground, the sea or Sicily. They never imagined war approaching from an unexpected direction, orchestrated by one who had studied their methods, understood their weaknesses, and sworn their destruction. The shadow of ancient Carthage was about to fall across the 7 hills themselves, carried by the most formidable military intellect of the classical world. The Iberian summer of 219 BC bore witness to a decisive moment. Saguntum, a prosperous city allied with Rome, yet positioned south of the Ebro boundary, represented both opportunity and provocation to Punic interests. The reports of its residents harassing Barcid allies provided the pretext the young commander had awaited. When emissaries from the Roman Senate arrived with stern warnings, they found themselves addressing empty air. The invading force had already departed for Saguntum, leaving diplomacy to wither in the Mediterranean heat. The die was cast. For 8 arduous months, the siege engines of the African army battered Saguntum's formidable walls. Inside the city, famine and desperation took root. Defenders hurled themselves into battle with the ferocity of the condemned, knowing Roman aid would surely arrive. Their faith proved misplaced. The Senate, paralyzed by internal debates and distant concerns, dispatched only words while their allies perished. As autumn leaves fell and winter descended, the assault continued unabated. Hamilcar's heir drove his engineers and troops beyond conventional limits, adapting tactics as circumstances demanded. When direct assault faltered, he ordered tunnels excavated beneath the defenses. When defenders collapsed one tunnel, 3 more appeared elsewhere. The final assault came during early spring. As the remaining Saguntine elders prepared terms of surrender, their citizens chose a different path. They constructed a massive pyre in the city centre and consigned themselves, their possessions, and their city to purifying flames, rather than submit to foreign rule. The conqueror stood amidst the ruins, watching smoke spiral toward indifferent gods. The immolation of Saguntum served its purpose. The Second Punic War had begun. When news reached the Seven Hills, public outrage erupted. The Senate dispatched envoys to the North African metropolis, demanding the general's surrender. The ruling council faced an impossible choice: abandon their most capable military leader or face Roman vengeance. An aged councillor named Hanno warned of disaster, reminding his peers of Roman naval superiority and the vulnerability of their coastal settlements. These cautious voices were drowned out by war fervour and the impassioned defence from the Barcid faction. After heated debate, the envoys received their answer. The treaty had specified the Ebro as the boundary, not Saguntum. No violation had occurred. No surrender would be forthcoming. The Roman delegation's response became legendary. Gathering his toga into a fold, the chief envoy addressed the council. "Here I carry both peace and war. Choose which you will receive." When the council president responded, "Give us whichever you prefer." The envoy let his garment fall open. "Then I give you war." The councillors replied with a single voice, "We accept it and shall prosecute it with the same spirit." Thus began the conflict that would determine a Mediterranean supremacy for centuries to come. Yet while Rome prepared for conventional warfare, assembling legions to invade Africa and Iberia, the Punic commander harboured plans that would shatter all precedent. As spring blossomed across the Iberian Peninsula in 218 BC, an extraordinary military enterprise took shape. While Roman strategists anticipated naval engagements and African landings, the Punic general prepared a maneuver of unprecedented audacity. He would strike not at Rome's distant territories, but at Italy itself, carrying devastation to the very heartland of the Republic. The force assembled at New Carthage presented a formidable spectacle: 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Those towering beasts of destruction, whose very appearance sent terror through enemy ranks. Yet more remarkable than these numbers was the diversity of the host. Libyan heavy infantry marched alongside Numidian horsemen. Balearic slingers practiced their lethal art, while Iberian tribesmen sharpened distinctive falcata swords. This was no mere military campaign, but a coalition of peoples united by a single man's vision. The march northward commenced with astonishing speed. The multinational force reached and crossed the Ebro before Roman vessels could establish an effective blockade. The Pyrenees loomed ahead, their peaks still crowned with winter's lingering snow. Here, the first test of resolve emerged as local tribes contested every mountain pass. Through a blend of diplomatic persuasion and ruthless combat efficiency, the advance pressed on. Yet the unforgiving terrain and constant skirmishing took a toll. By the time they descended into Gaul, nearly 20,000 had been lost to desertion or battle. In Gaul, the general wielded gold and eloquence with equal effectiveness. Some tribal leaders saw opportunity in siding with this extraordinary figure from the south. Others recognized the existential threat his passage represented. Through careful negotiation and occasional shows of overwhelming might, safe passage through the lowlands was secured en route to the most daunting challenge yet. By early autumn, the vanguard reached the Alpine foothills. Here stood mountains unlike anything African or Iberian troops had encountered, vast, implacable barriers scraping the sky. Ancient sources record the leader's address to his faltering troops, reminding them that others had crossed these heights before. "We are not scaling the walls of heaven," he reportedly told them. "These mountains are surmountable by men, indeed by women and children of the native tribes who call them home." What followed remains one of military history's most astonishing achievements. The ascent began along treacherous trails barely wide enough for single-file columns, let alone elephants and supply wagons. Mountain tribes hurled boulders from unreachable heights. Ravines claimed both men and beasts. Frigid winds tore at exposed skin, and snow and ice made every step perilous. The most daunting moment came when a rockslide obliterated the path ahead, leaving only a sheer cliff face. For 3 days, progress halted, while engineers undertook a seemingly impossible task. They built massive fires against the rock wall, then doused the heated surface with vinegar, causing it to fracture. Teams widened the resulting fissures until a new route emerged from the living stone. After 15 days of alpine torment, the forward elements crested the final pass. The sight that greeted the exhausted soldiers was immortalized by Livy. The verdant plains of northern Italy spread below like a promised land. Their leader ascended a promontory alone and gazed upon the country of his sworn enemy. Behind them lay thousands of dead, lost to the mountains and ambushes. Ahead waited Roman legions, still unaware of the storm descending from the heights. When the final count was taken on the plains below, the cost of the daring passage became clear. Of the 90,000 infantry who had left New Carthage, only 20,000 remained fit for combat. Cavalry strength had dwindled from 12,000 to 6,000. Most of the elephants had perished. Only a few remained to strike terror into Italian hearts. Yet despite these losses, the Alpine crossing had achieved its strategic objective. The invading force now stood on Italian soil, having executed a maneuver Rome deemed impossible. More significantly, they arrived at a perfect moment to exploit growing tensions between the Republic and the Gallic tribes of the Po Valley. These disaffected peoples now flocked to their banner, swelling the ranks with fresh warriors eager to exact vengeance upon Rome. The passage of the Alps would be celebrated for centuries as a testament to human will. But for the architect of this feat, it was merely the opening move in a grand design to bring the Roman colossus to its knees. The initial encounters on Italian soil revealed a fundamental contrast in military philosophy. Roman warfare emphasized disciplined formation fighting, the manipular system that had conquered the peninsula. In contrast, Hannibal's approach displayed remarkable flexibility, adapting tactics to terrain and circumstance while exploiting the unique capabilities of his diverse troops. At the Ticinus River, the Republic dispatched a reconnaissance force led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio. What followed was not a pitched battle, but a cavalry engagement that demonstrated the superiority of Numidian and Spanish horsemen over their Roman counterparts. The consul himself suffered a severe wound, saved from death only by the valiant intervention of his teenage son, a youth who would later earn the cognomen Africanus and bring ultimate defeat to his father's adversary. The clash at the Trebia River in late December of 218 BC revealed Hannibal's tactical brilliance in full measure. Facing a Roman army under the consul Sempronius Longus, he placed his brother Mago with 2,000 elite troops in concealed positions near the battlefield. Then, through a series of provocations, he lured the Roman force across the freezing river at dawn. The legionaries arrived at the battlefront already exhausted, wet, and chilled to the bone. As the main forces engaged, Mago's hidden contingent struck the Roman rear with devastating effect. Caught between multiple threats, with their flanks collapsing under cavalry pressure, the legions broke formation. Nearly 20,000 Romans perished, while those who escaped owed their lives to a fortuitous rainstorm that obscured their retreat. Following these victories, the Punic force wintered in northern Italy, building alliances with Gallic tribes eager to throw off Roman domination. Spring brought a hazardous march through the flooded marshlands of the Arno. For 4 days and nights, the soldiers waded through brackish waters, unable to find dry ground for rest. Hannibal himself, mounted on the sole surviving war elephant, developed an eye infection that would ultimately claim the sight in his right eye, a permanent physical mark of his commitment to the campaign. The following year saw the debacle at Lake Trasimene, which elevated military deception to an art form. The new consul, Gaius Flaminius, eager to engage the invaders, pursued their apparent retreat along the lakeshore. Blinded by morning mist and focused solely on the visible elements of the enemy column, the Romans marched directly into a perfectly crafted ambush. Hannibal had positioned his troops on the surrounding heights overnight, creating an enclosed killing ground. When signal fires blazed on the hillsides, the trap closed. Thousands of warriors descended from concealed positions, striking the unprepared Roman column from all sides. Unable to form proper battle lines in the narrow passage between lake and hills, the legionaries fought as individuals rather than as the disciplined unit their tactics required. The result was slaughter. 15,000 Romans died, including Flaminius himself. Another 15,000 surrendered. A mere 6,000 escaped to carry news of the catastrophe to Rome. These successive defeats triggered unprecedented measures in the capital. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, granting him extraordinary powers to address the crisis. Recognizing the futility of direct confrontation, Fabius adopted a strategy of attrition, following the invading army at a safe distance, harassing supply lines, avoiding pitched battles, and gradually wearing down the numerically inferior force. This approach earned Fabius the derisive nickname Cunctator, the delayer, from impatient Romans eager for decisive action. For months, this shadow dance continued across central Italy. Though tactically sound, the Fabian strategy proved politically unsustainable. Roman citizens demanded confrontation and victory, not careful maneuvering. As elections approached, popular sentiment favored aggressive action, leading to the appointment of Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus as consuls for the coming year. Under pressure to deliver a decisive victory, these new commanders assembled the largest Roman army yet fielded, 8 legions with supporting allies, nearly 80,000 infantry, and several thousand cavalry. They tracked Hannibal's force to Cannae, a village in southeastern Italy where the invaders had established a supply depot. Here, on an August day that would live in military infamy, the opposing forces met on a dusty plain near the Aufidus River. What transpired at Cannae defied conventional understanding of ancient warfare. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Hannibal arranged his forces in an unconventional formation. He placed his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, at the center in a convex arc, while positioning his veteran Libyan heavy infantry on the flanks. His superior cavalry formed the wings, tasked with driving off the Roman horse and then enveloping the enemy rear. As the battle commenced, the Roman center advanced confidently against the seemingly vulnerable middle of the Africans' line. The arc bent backward under pressure but did not break, gradually forming a concave formation that continued to yield ground while maintaining cohesion. Meanwhile, the Punic cavalry routed their Roman counterparts and swung around to the rear of the advancing legions. The trap closed with mathematical precision. As Roman forces pressed deeper into the collapsing center, the veteran Libyan infantry on the flanks wheeled inward. Simultaneously, the returning cavalry sealed the encirclement from behind. The vast Roman army found itself surrounded, compressed into a tightening pocket, where their superior numbers became a critical disadvantage. So densely packed were the legionaries that many could not raise their arms to defend themselves. What followed was systematic annihilation. For hours, the killing continued as the encircled Romans, unable to maneuver or escape, were methodically cut down. When darkness finally ended the slaughter, between 50 and 70,000 Romans and allies lay dead or dying on the field. The consul Paulus perished alongside 80 senators who had taken the field. Varro escaped with a small cavalry contingent, bearing news of a defeat unprecedented in Roman history. Cannae represented not merely a tactical victory, but the perfection of battlefield geometry. Military academies worldwide still study this engagement as the quintessential battle of annihilation. In its aftermath, numerous Italian cities abandoned their Roman allegiance. The great ports of Syracuse in Sicily and Tarentum in southern Italy opened their gates to the invaders. Macedonia's king, Philip V, negotiated an alliance against their common Roman enemy. In the capital, citizens awaited the inevitable assault on their city walls. Survivors reported that the path to Rome lay open, with inadequate forces remaining to defend the Seven Hills. A famous exchange, recorded by ancient historians, allegedly occurred between the victorious general and his cavalry commander, Hannibal. When Hannibal declined to immediately march on Rome, preferring to consolidate his position in southern Italy, Hannibal supposedly remarked, "You know how to win victories, but not how to use them." Whether this strategic decision represented wisdom or lost opportunity would be debated for centuries. What remained indisputable was the profound psychological impact of Cannae, a wound in the Roman consciousness that would never fully heal. For 15 years following Cannae, Hannibal maintained his army on Italian soil, an astonishing feat of logistics and leadership. Without secure supply lines to his homeland, he sustained operations through careful management of resources, alliances with Italian communities, and tactical flexibility. His presence alone forced Rome to maintain multiple armies in the field, draining the Republic's manpower and treasury. Yet even as the Punic general established dominance in southern Italy, Roman resilience manifested in unexpected ways. The Republic's response to catastrophic defeat revealed strengths that would ultimately prove decisive. Unlike other Mediterranean powers that typically negotiated terms after major battlefield losses, Rome refused to consider peace. The Senate declared that no discussions would occur while foreign troops remained on Italian soil. This intransigence transformed the conflict into a test of endurance that played to Roman demographic advantages. Under the guidance of Fabius Maximus, whose cautious strategy gained renewed appreciation after Cannae, Roman forces avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal's main army. Instead, they recaptured defecting cities one by one, punishing those who had abandoned the Roman cause. The message became clear. The invader might win battles, but Rome would inevitably reclaim its territories. Communities contemplating defection had to weigh temporary relief against eventual retribution. Two emerging Roman commanders demonstrated the adaptability that would eventually overcome the Punic threat. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, called the Sword of Rome, balanced Fabian caution with aggressive action when circumstances favored it. After a prolonged siege, his forces recaptured Syracuse in the 12th year of the war, despite defensive works designed by the mathematical genius Archimedes. The brilliant scientist perished during the city's capture, reportedly killed by a Roman soldier while absorbed in geometric calculations. Meanwhile, a more significant threat developed in Iberia, where Carthage's position had weakened following the departure of the main expeditionary force. The young Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had died fighting in the peninsula, received command of Roman forces there despite his youth and limited experience. This exceptional appointment reflected both his family's sacrifice and his natural talents. 3 years later, Scipio's capture of New Carthage demonstrated tactical brilliance worthy of his adversary. Learning that the city's northern defences were weakly manned due to a lagoon considered impassable, he discovered that the water level dropped significantly during certain winds. During the main assault, he sent a selected force through the temporarily shallow waters, achieving complete surprise and capturing the North African power's capital in Spain, along with its valuable silver mines. Within 3 more years, Scipio had effectively eliminated Punic presence from the Iberian Peninsula, depriving Hannibal in Italy of reinforcements and revenue. Returning to Rome, he proposed a bold strategy, taking the war to Africa itself, forcing the enemy to recall its greatest general to defend the homeland. Though conservative elements in the Senate opposed this plan, Scipio's popular support secured him the consulship and authority to implement his vision. The following year saw the African campaign commence, with Roman legions establishing a beachhead near Utica. Early victories and an alliance with the Numidian prince Massinissa strengthened the Roman position. As Scipio's forces threatened Carthage itself, the ruling council finally recalled Hannibal from Italy, ending his 16-year occupation of Roman territory. His departure from Italian shores represented both tactical necessity and personal heartbreak. The veteran soldiers who had followed him across the Alps, who had triumphed at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, who had sustained themselves for years in hostile territory, now withdrew to defend distant shores. As his army embarked from Croton, the general reportedly gazed back at the land where he had demonstrated his genius, knowing he might never return. The climactic confrontation occurred in autumn of the year 202, near the village of Zama. For the first time, the two greatest commanders of their age, the Punic master of mobile warfare and the Roman innovator, faced each other directly. The invader of Italy assembled a force that included veterans from his Italian campaigns, alongside fresh levies and 80 war elephants. Scipio arranged his legions in an unconventional formation, creating lanes through which the charging elephants could pass harmlessly. As the battle developed, Scipio demonstrated that he had studied and internalized his opponent's methods. While the infantry engagement remained undecided, the superior Roman and Numidian cavalry drove their counterparts from the field, then returned to strike Hannibal's rear, exactly as had occurred at Cannae, but with roles reversed. The veteran commander fought brilliantly, but found himself outmaneuvered by a younger general who had learned from his own tactics. This defeat ended the Second Punic War. Carthage accepted harsh terms: surrender of its navy and war elephants, abandonment of all territories outside Africa, payment of a crushing indemnity over 50 years, and a prohibition against waging war without Roman permission. The great maritime power became, effectively, a Roman client state. For the defeated commander, the story continued. Though some urged him to continue resistance, Hannibal advocated peace, recognizing that further conflict would only bring destruction upon his homeland. In the years that followed, he implemented political and economic reforms to help Carthage rebuild, despite Roman restrictions. Eventually, Roman demands for his surrender forced him into exile at the court of Antiochus III of Syria, where he contributed strategic advice during that monarch's ultimately unsuccessful war against Rome. Pursued relentlessly by Roman agents across the Mediterranean, the aging strategist found increasingly precarious refuge in various courts. When his final protector, King Prusias of Bithynia, prepared to surrender him to Rome, he chose poison over captivity. According to Plutarch, his final words acknowledged the implacable enemy that had defined his existence. Let us relieve the Romans from their fear, since they think it long to wait for the death of an old man. Half a century after Hannibal's death, the Third Punic War erupted, having nothing to do with the great commander who had brought Rome to the edge of destruction. This final conflict represented Roman determination to eliminate a recovering commercial rival. After a 3-year siege, Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Africanus, destroyed the city completely. The ground was sown with salt, the population enslaved, and one of Mediterranean civilization's greatest centers obliterated from the earth. Yet Hannibal's legacy endured far beyond his death or his city's destruction. His tactical innovations influenced Roman military development for centuries. The comprehensive strategy he employed, diplomatic, psychological, and military, established a template for subsequent commanders. Even in defeat, he had forced Rome to evolve, to become more resilient, more adaptive, and ultimately more dominant. Perhaps his greatest monument lies not in stone, but in the intangible realm of human achievement, demonstrating how vision, courage, and intellectual brilliance can enable one individual to challenge an empire. Though ultimately unsuccessful, his 16-year campaign against overwhelming odds remains a testament to the extraordinary possibilities of human will and imagination in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. While swords and spears dominated the physical realm of conflict, an equally consequential struggle unfolded across the diplomatic landscape of the Mediterranean. Throughout the protracted contest between Carthage and Rome, alliances shifted like sand beneath desert winds, with smaller powers calculating their interests against the backdrop of titanic confrontation. Prior to the Alpine descent, Hannibal had secured his rear through systematic cultivation of Iberian tribal loyalties. Unlike previous Punic administrators who ruled through intimidation, the son of Hamilcar recognized the value of cultural respect and personal connection. His fluency in local languages, marital alliance with an Iberian princess, and participation in indigenous religious ceremonies transformed subjugated peoples into willing confederates. This diplomatic acumen extended to Gallic territories, where advance emissaries established connections long before the main force arrived at the Rhone crossing. The Boii and Insubres tribes of northern Italy had recently suffered harsh Roman pacification, their lands confiscated for veteran colonies, their warriors slaughtered for displaying independence. These grievances provided fertile ground for anti-Roman sentiment that the invader skillfully cultivated. After the triumph at Cannae, the strategic chessboard expanded dramatically. Capua, Italy's second-largest city, transferred allegiance to the Punic cause, providing urban infrastructure that the predominantly mobile force had previously lacked. Syracuse, long maintained as a nominally independent ally of Rome, despite effective occupation, embraced freedom under King Hieronymus, grandson of the legendary Hiero II. Perhaps most significantly, Philip V of Macedon recognized opportunity in Rome's moment of profound vulnerability. The ambitious Antigonid monarch negotiated a formal treaty with Carthage 3 years after Hannibal's invasion, creating a potential two-front war beyond the Republic's capacity to manage. Had this Macedonian alliance been fully activated rather than merely potential, the outcome of the entire conflict might have differed fundamentally. The Roman diplomatic response revealed institutional strengths that compensated for battlefield defeats. Despite catastrophic losses of manpower and resources, the Senate maintained existing alliances through a combination of inspirational steadfastness and calculated intimidation. When wavering Italian communities contemplated defection, prompt military demonstrations, often involving public execution of pro-Punic factions, reinforced the consequences of disloyalty. More subtly, the Romans exploited ethnic and class divisions within communities under Hannibal's influence. In Capua, they cultivated aristocratic elements who chafed under populist reforms implemented by the invader. In Syracuse, they maintained communication with factions opposed to King Hieronymus's increasingly tyrannical governance. These internal connections proved invaluable when opportunities for counter-revolution emerged. The diplomatic contest extended to peripheral powers with strategic significance. Numidia, whose light cavalry constituted the elite of Carthage's mounted forces, contained rival kingdoms with conflicting interests. The Roman diplomatic corps identified Massinissa, a dispossessed Numidian prince with legitimate grievances against Carthage, as a potential asset. Their cultivation of this relationship would ultimately bear fruit at Zama, where Numidian cavalry transferred allegiance with devastating effect. In the Hellenic East, Roman diplomats neutralized the Macedonian threat through alliance with the Aetolian League, creating sufficient pressure on Philip V to prevent his full engagement in the Western conflict. Simultaneously, they maintained connections with Ptolemaic Egypt, ensuring that Africa's richest grain-producing region remained inaccessible to Punic interests. Perhaps most revealing of diplomatic impact were the events that unfolded in Tarentum, a major Greek port city in southern Italy. Frustrated by Roman garrison forces that restricted their autonomy, prominent citizens secretly communicated with Hannibal's camp, offering to open their gates. During the 12th year of war, this conspiracy succeeded in admitting the invaders' forces, yet the Roman garrison commander had received intelligence of the plot. While unable to prevent the city's fall, he withdrew his forces to the citadel overlooking the harbour, maintaining control of maritime access and effectively neutralizing Tarentum's strategic value. The nuanced diplomatic landscape revealed a fundamental difference between the competing powers. The Punic approach to alliance building centered on the charismatic leadership of one extraordinary individual whose personal guarantees and relationships sustained coalition integrity. The Roman system operated institutionally, with the Senate maintaining consistent policy despite changing magistrates and fluctuating fortunes. This distinction proved consequential as the conflict extended across decades. When Hannibal focused attention on one theatre, alliances in other regions often deteriorated without his personal presence. Roman diplomatic relationships, embedded in institutional continuity, demonstrated greater resilience against the vagaries of individual leadership. The peace terms, imposed after Zama, reflected Rome's understanding of diplomatic reality. By permitting Carthage to retain its core African territories while stripping away external possessions, the Senate created a buffer state dependent on Roman protection against Numidian expansion. By prohibiting independent military action, they transformed a rival into a subordinate ally. By imposing financial obligations over 50 years, they ensured generational alignment of interests. The diplomatic aftermath extended well beyond formal treaties. Hannibal, briefly serving as suffet chief magistrate after the war, implemented governmental reforms that threatened established oligarchic interests. His efforts to reduce corruption and distribute tax burdens more equitably generated powerful enemies who eventually collaborated with Roman factions seeking his elimination. As the defeated general departed his homeland for the final time, seeking refuge at foreign courts, the diplomatic web contracted around him. Roman envoys followed his movements, pressuring successive hosts, Antiochus of Syria, Armenia, Bithynia, to surrender the aging commander. This relentless diplomatic pursuit, conducted while Roman military power expanded eastward into Hellenic territories, demonstrated the Republic's long institutional memory and commitment to eliminating potential threats regardless of time elapsed. The diplomatic dimension of the Punic conflict transcended individual personalities to reshape Mediterranean geopolitics for centuries. What began as competition between commercial powers evolved into Roman hegemony, with former rivals transformed into clients, allies into subjects, and neutral parties into dependents. The diplomatic chessboard, once populated by multiple independent actors, gradually simplified into a unipolar system with Rome at its center. This transformation, as significant as any battlefield outcome, established patterns of international relations that would characterize the Mediterranean world until the empire's distant fall. The legacy of that diplomatic revolution continues to influence concepts of international order, alliance systems, and great power competition in the modern age. Beneath the surface of martial glory and diplomatic maneuvering lay the fundamental economic realities that shaped the protracted struggle between Mediterranean powers. The Punic conflicts represented not merely clashes of armies, but competitions between distinct economic systems, each with inherent strengths and fatal vulnerabilities. The Carthaginian economic model rested upon three pillars: maritime commerce, agricultural estates, and Spanish silver. As Phoenician colonists, their original settlement had been established primarily as a trading hub, strategically positioned to facilitate exchange between the eastern and western Mediterranean. By the mid-3rd century, their commercial network extended from the Black Sea to Britain, with specialized trading vessels carrying textiles, ceramics, precious metals, and agricultural products across established sea lanes. This commercial orientation influenced every aspect of Punic society. Unlike Rome, where political office provided the primary route to social advancement, Carthaginian elites derived status primarily from mercantile success. Their governing council comprised leading merchant families, whose primary allegiance often lay with commercial interests rather than state policy. This created decision-making patterns that prioritized immediate profit over long-term strategic considerations, a tendency the Barcid faction consistently opposed. The agricultural foundation of Carthaginian wealth resided in large North African estates employing advanced farming techniques. These plantations, described admiringly by Roman writers like Cato the Elder, implemented sophisticated crop rotation irrigation systems, and specialized cultivation methods. The resulting agricultural surplus generated substantial export revenue while supporting the urban population of the capital, which may have reached 500,000 inhabitants during the height of Punic prosperity. Spanish silver mines, particularly those around New Carthage, provided the final economic pillar. The extraction operations, conducted primarily through slave labor under harsh conditions, produced extraordinary wealth, reportedly yielding 300 pounds of silver daily during peak periods. This mineral wealth funded military operations, subsidized diplomatic initiatives, and balanced trade deficits during wartime disruption of maritime commerce. The Roman economic system presented stark contrasts. Agricultural production dominated, with a particular emphasis on small to medium landholdings worked by citizen farmers, who simultaneously constituted the military backbone of the Republic. This structural integration of economic and military functions created remarkable resilience against temporary setbacks. While Hannibal's forces could devastate Italian farmlands, the human capital those lands produced, citizen soldiers committed to defending their patrimony, remained the Republic's decisive resource. Commercial activities held secondary importance in early Roman economic thinking, with patrician elites traditionally disdaining direct involvement in trade. However, the equestrian order, equites, increasingly engaged in commercial ventures, creating an influential constituency advocating for trade protection and expansion. Their interests aligned with territorial expansion, as new provinces offered both markets and resources for commercial exploitation. This structural distinction became evident in responses to the pressure of prolonged conflict. When maritime commerce suffered disruption, Carthaginian state revenues declined precipitously, limiting military options. Conversely, Roman agricultural self-sufficiency, combined with the ability to extract resources from subject territories across Italy, provided greater staying power during extended hostilities. The Second Punic War strained both economic systems to breaking points. For Carthage, the loss of Spanish silver mines after Scipio's Iberian campaign created insurmountable financial difficulties. Without these mineral resources, maintaining mercenary forces in Italy became increasingly untenable, ultimately necessitating the withdrawal of Hannibal's expedition, despite its battlefield successes. Rome faced different challenges. The devastation of Italian agriculture, with some regions experiencing 15 consecutive years of crop destruction, created severe food shortages. Naval blockades intermittently threatened grain imports from Sicily and Egypt. Most critically, the manpower demands of maintaining multiple armies stretched demographic resources to their limits, with some estimates suggesting that 1/3 of military-age Roman citizens perished during the conflict. The Roman response to these pressures revealed institutional creativity that would prove decisive. When normal revenue sources proved inadequate, the Senate implemented emergency measures, including voluntary loans from wealthy citizens, leveraging patriotic sentiment and offering preferential repayment terms. They also engaged in debasement of currency, reducing silver content in coinage to expand money supply. Further measures included deferred payment to military contractors, essentially forcing private entities to finance state operations, and progressive tax structures that placed heavier burdens on elite wealth. Perhaps most indicatively, when the Treasury exhausted all conventional funding sources after Cannae, the Senate urged citizens to donate personal gold and silver for military purposes. The resulting collection provided sufficient resources to continue resistance when defeat seemed imminent, a demonstration of social cohesion that transcended economic rationality. The aftermath of conflict revealed divergent economic trajectories. Rome and Italy, despite massive physical destruction, experienced eventual agricultural revitalization through redistribution of land to veteran soldiers. The capture of Punic territories, particularly Spain and Sicily, provided new economic opportunities through colonization, resource extraction, and tax collection. The influx of war indemnities, paid by Carthage over decades, further stimulated economic development within the expanding Roman sphere. For Carthage, post-war reconstruction efforts faced severe constraints. The loss of external territories eliminated crucial resource bases. Trade routes gradually reoriented toward Roman ports like Ostia, Puteoli, and Syracuse. The prohibition against independent military action prevented responses to Numidian encroachment on agricultural lands. Despite these limitations, the resilient commercial culture adapted through intensified agricultural development and renewed trading initiatives within permitted parameters. The interwar period witnessed an attempted economic renaissance under reformist leadership. Upon returning from exile in the late 1900s, Hannibal applied his strategic acumen to financial matters, implementing reforms, including prosecution of corrupt officials who had embezzled public funds. He also restructured tax collection to ensure revenues reached state coffers and conducted audits of foreign debt obligations to eliminate fraudulent claims. Additionally, he developed state monopolies in key sectors to generate public revenue. These measures proved remarkably effective, enabling Carthage to offer early repayment of war indemnities, a development that paradoxically heightened Roman concerns about renewed Punic economic vibrancy. The Senate's insistence on maintaining the original payment schedule, despite available funds, revealed underlying anxiety about commercial competition, presaging the eventual decision to eliminate the ancient trading power entirely. The Third Punic War reflected economic motivations thinly veiled by security pretexts. As Carthage recovered commercial vitality within the constraints imposed at Zama, Roman economic interests, particularly among equites engaged in competing trade activities, advocated eliminating this resurgent competitor. Cato the Elder's famous declaration that Carthage must be destroyed, Carthago delendo est, resonated with agricultural and commercial factions alike, though for different reasons. The final destruction of the city obliterated an economic system that had flourished for 7 centuries. Specialized knowledge disappeared as skilled craftsmen perished or entered slavery. Trade networks disintegrated as established patterns of exchange collapsed. Agricultural innovations survived primarily through Roman adaptation, as documented in Mago's Agricultural Treatise, the sole Punic literary work Romans considered worthy of preservation and translation. The long-term economic consequences of this civilizational extinction extended far beyond immediate Roman gains. The elimination of Carthage removed a commercial counterweight that had facilitated economic diversity across the Mediterranean basin. Smaller trading states lost negotiating leverage as Roman commercial interests established regional monopolies. The destruction of sophisticated banking and credit systems based in the Punic capital created financial disruptions that persisted for generations. The economic narrative of the Punic Wars thus reveals a fundamental divergence between commercial and agricultural paradigms, between trade networks and territorial control, between mercantile pragmatism and imperial ambition. This underlying economic dimension shaped strategic decisions, determined resource availability, and ultimately influenced outcomes more profoundly than individual battles. In the final accounting, Rome's economic system prevailed, not because it generated greater wealth. Carthage initially commanded vastly superior financial resources, but because it produced greater resilience against sustained pressure. The integration of economic activity with political and military structures created institutional strength that transcended material advantages, establishing patterns that would characterize Western economic organization for centuries to come. Beyond battlefields and diplomatic chambers, the prolonged struggle between Rome and Carthage precipitated profound cultural transformations that would ultimately reshape Mediterranean civilization. The collision between these disparate societies, one rooted in Phoenician mercantile traditions, the other in Latin Italic agrarian values, generated cultural exchanges, appropriations, and reactions that transcended immediate political outcomes. Prior to the initial conflict in the mid-3rd century, Roman culture exhibited remarkable insularity. The nascent republic had assimilated Etruscan and Greek influences, yet maintained distinctive cultural patterns characterized by ancestral reverence, strict patriarchal structures, and civic morality. Religious practices emphasized proper observance of ritual rather than theological sophistication. Artistic expression served predominantly practical functions, with limited attention to aesthetic refinement for its own sake. Carthaginian culture presented striking contrasts. Descended from Phoenician settlers, yet influenced by indigenous North African traditions, Punic society developed sophisticated artistic forms, complex religious systems, and cosmopolitan sensibilities befitting a maritime trading network. The worship of deities like Baal Hammon and Tanit incorporated elaborate ceremonies, while decorative arts displayed Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern aesthetic elements integrated into distinctive styles. The initial phase of cultural interaction occurred primarily through Sicily, where Punic and Hellenistic influences had mingled for centuries. As Roman forces occupied formerly Carthaginian territories, they encountered architectural forms, agricultural techniques, and administrative systems that offered practical advantages over traditional Italian approaches. The pragmatic Roman temperament readily adopted useful innovations while discarding elements deemed decadent or threatening to established values. The invasion of Italy catalyzed unprecedented cultural anxieties within Roman society. As Hannibal's armies penetrated central regions, traditional certainties faltered. Religious authorities interpreted battlefield defeats as divine disfavor, prompting extraordinary ritual responses, including human sacrifice, a practice explicitly rejected under normal circumstances, but recorded by Livy following the disaster at Cannae. Such extreme measures revealed profound psychological disorientation within a society whose cultural framework lacked explanatory models for repeated failure against a seemingly unstoppable adversary. Literary responses to this existential crisis emerged through figures like Quintus Ennius, whose epic poem, Annales, reframed Roman historical understanding to emphasize manifest destiny and inevitable triumph despite temporary setbacks. This deliberate cultural project, creating narrative coherence from chaotic experience, established patterns of historical interpretation that would influence Roman self-conception for centuries. The prolonged presence of Punic forces in southern Italy introduced direct cultural contact unmediated by previous Hellenistic filters. Citizen soldiers returning to central Italy brought not only battlefield experiences, but exposure to alternative social organizations, religious practices, and technological applications. Archaeological evidence indicates accelerated adoption of Carthaginian agricultural implements, construction techniques, and maritime technologies during and immediately following the conflict. For the multi-ethnic coalition under Hannibal, extended campaigns across diverse Italian landscapes similarly prompted cultural adaptations. The commander's renowned capacity to maintain coalition coherence despite ethnic and linguistic differences required sophisticated cultural intelligence and communicative flexibility. Evidence suggests deliberate adoption of Roman military innovations, particularly regarding camp fortification and siege techniques, demonstrating pragmatic appropriation transcending cultural chauvinism. The resolution of the Second Punic War initiated the most significant phase of cultural interaction. As Roman power expanded through former Carthaginian territories, administrative necessities demanded engagement with established social structures. The Republic's traditional governance models, designed for Italian communities with shared cultural backgrounds, proved inadequate for managing diverse populations across the Western Mediterranean. This administrative challenge generated new cultural syntheses. In Sicily, Roman governors incorporated elements of previous Carthaginian provincial administration, while imposing distinctively Roman legal frameworks. In Spain, where Punic influence had transformed indigenous communities, Roman authorities retained effective governance systems, while gradually introducing Latin cultural elements through veteran colonies and commercial interactions. Literary and artistic dimensions reflected these complex interactions. Rome's first native historian, Quintus Fabius Pictor, composed his account of the conflict in Greek rather than Latin, an acknowledgement that engagement with the wider Mediterranean world required cultural adaptations. Simultaneously, the first translations of Greek literary works into Latin occurred during this period, indicating recognition that Roman cultural expression required enrichment to address expanded imperial responsibilities. Hannibal, during his brief political career following the conflict, implemented administrative reforms influenced by Roman models, while maintaining distinctive Punic institutional structures. His deep familiarity with Roman society, gained through 16 years of warfare on Italian soil, informed governance approaches that selectively incorporated effective elements from the victorious adversary while preserving cultural continuity. Religious transformations perhaps most clearly demonstrated the complex cultural interactions triggered by the protracted conflict. Traditional Roman religious practice centered on transactional relationships with deities who protected the state encountered alternative models through prolonged exposure to Hellenistic and Punic religious systems. The aftermath of war witnessed accelerated adoption of Eastern cults, most notably the Magna Mater, Cybele, whose worship received official sanction during the final phases of the conflict, following consultation of the Sibylline books. This religious openness represented not abandonment of traditional practices, but their supplementation through cultural appropriation. The capacity to incorporate useful religious elements from defeated adversaries while maintaining core cultural identity exemplified Roman adaptive capabilities. Significantly, however, the Senate explicitly rejected aspects of Punic religion associated with child sacrifice, demonstrating selective rather than wholesale cultural adoption. The final destruction of Carthage in the mid-2nd century paradoxically ensured the preservation of certain Punic cultural elements through their incorporation into emerging Roman imperial culture. Agricultural techniques documented in Mago's treatise on farming received authoritative status through senatorial endorsement of the work's translation. Architectural and engineering principles developed in North Africa informed Roman construction practices throughout newly acquired territories. Maritime commercial networks established by Carthaginian traders provided templates for expanded Roman commercial activities. The cultural legacies of this centuries-long encounter extended far beyond immediate participants. As Rome expanded into Hellenistic Eastern territories, administrative approaches developed for managing former Carthaginian possessions informed governance strategies applied to these new provinces. The multiculturalism necessitated by imperial expansion had been rehearsed through engagement with Punic cultural traditions, establishing precedents for selective incorporation rather than wholesale imposition of Latin models. For subsequent generations, the Punic conflict acquired mythic significance within Roman cultural memory. Cato the Elder's obsessive repetition of Carthago delenda est indicated how thoroughly the rival power had penetrated Roman consciousness. Literary treatments by Virgil, Livy, and Silius Italicus transformed historical events into cultural touchstones that reinforced Roman self-conception as a people destined for universal dominion through superior virtue rather than mere military prowess. Hannibal himself underwent cultural transformation within this narrative framework, simultaneously representing both the quintessential adversary and a figure of tragic nobility. Cicero's philosophical dialogues presented him as embodying virtues Romans admired: strategic brilliance, personal austerity, unwavering commitment, while remaining the essential other against whom Roman identity defined itself. This cultural construction transcended historical reality to fulfill psychological needs within Roman society. Perhaps most significant for subsequent Western civilization was the emergence of cultural models for imperial governance that balanced pragmatic flexibility with core value preservation. The Roman encounter with Carthaginian civilization demonstrated possibilities for cultural exchange that neither erased distinctive identity nor prevented effective administration of diverse populations. This precedent informed subsequent imperial projects across millennia, from Byzantine adaptation of Roman models to early modern European colonial endeavors. The cultural dimensions of the Punic conflict thus extended far beyond immediate participants to shape fundamental patterns of cross-cultural interaction throughout Western history. What began as collision between distinct Mediterranean societies ultimately produced synthetic cultural forms that transmitted elements of both traditions through subsequent centuries. In this respect, Carthage achieved a form of immortality despite physical obliteration, its cultural DNA integrated into the imperial system that had ensured its destruction. 2 millennia after the final stones of Carthage were scattered and its fields sown with salt, the reverberations of the Punic Wars continue to shape our understanding of history, strategy, and human potential. The multifaceted legacy of this ancient conflict transcends its immediate outcomes to influence military thought, political development, and cultural imagination across centuries. In the military realm, the tactical innovations demonstrated throughout the conflict established paradigms that would define Western approaches to warfare for generations. The Battle of Cannae, that masterpiece of battlefield geometry, remains required study at military academies worldwide. Its double envelopment maneuver reappeared throughout subsequent military history, from Frederick the Great's oblique assault at Leuthen to Moltke's encirclement at Sedan, to Schwarzkopf's left hook during Desert Storm. Beyond specific tactical arrangements, Hannibal's campaign in Italy established conceptual foundations for maneuver warfare, strategic deception, and psychological operations. By consistently operating against Roman expectations, crossing supposedly impassable terrain, appearing where logistically impossible, maintaining cohesion among disparate forces, the Punic commander created an intellectual framework for asymmetric warfare that would influence military thinkers from Sun Tzu to T.E. Lawrence. The Roman response to these innovations proved equally influential for subsequent military development. Fabius Maximus's strategy of delay and attrition, initially derided yet ultimately vindicated, established the concept of trading space for time when facing superior battlefield opponents. This approach would reappear throughout military history, from Kutuzov against Napoleon to Soviet resistance against Nazi invasion. The very term Fabian strategy entered the lexicon of military science, honoring its originator while obscuring the Carthaginian adversary who necessitated its development. Perhaps most significantly, the ultimate Roman victory, despite crushing tactical defeats, demonstrated the crucial distinction between winning battles and winning wars. This lesson that strategic patience and systemic resilience can overcome tactical brilliance remains central to comprehensive security thinking in the modern era. Contemporary military educators often cite the Punic conflict when emphasizing that victory requires alignment of tactical, operational, and strategic levels of warfare. In political realms, the conflict's legacy proved equally profound. The existential challenge posed by Hannibal's invasion catalyzed institutional developments within the Roman Republic that both strengthened and ultimately undermined its constitutional structure. The emergency powers granted to dictators like Fabius established precedents for executive authority that would later enable figures like Sulla and Caesar to transform the Republic into autocracy. More subtly, the expansion of Roman power following the conflict fundamentally altered relationships between citizens, allies, and subjects. The incorporation of former Carthaginian territories initiated transformations in governance approaches that would gradually evolve into the provincial system of the later empire. The encounter with diverse populations and administrative traditions necessitated flexibility that both enriched and challenged traditional Roman political culture. For subsequent political theorists, the conflict provided essential case studies in competing systems. Machiavelli devoted significant attention to the Punic Wars in his discourses on Livy, contrasting the stability of Rome's republican institutions with the mercantile pragmatism of Carthaginian governance. His analysis established interpretive frameworks that influenced Renaissance political thought and subsequent republican theory throughout the Enlightenment. The economic consequences reverberated across centuries as well. The destruction of Carthage eliminated a commercial counterweight that had facilitated economic diversity across the Mediterranean basin. Rome's subsequent economic hegemony reduced commercial competition while expanding wealth extraction from provincial territories. This centralizing tendency established patterns of core-periphery economic relationships that characterized imperial systems well into the modern era. More positively, the technological and agricultural innovations preserved from Punic civilization enhanced productive capacity throughout Roman territories. Irrigation techniques, crop rotation systems, and specialized cultivation methods documented in Margot's treatise improved agricultural yields across regions from North Africa to Gaul. Maritime technologies adopted from Carthaginian shipbuilding traditions facilitated expanded Mediterranean commerce under the Pax Romana. The cultural legacy proves perhaps most enduring yet subtle. The narrative of Hannibal's resilience against overwhelming odds, maintaining resistance for 16 years on enemy soil without regular supply lines or reinforcement, established an archetype of the brilliant underdog that resonates across cultural traditions. From contemporary Roman acknowledgement of the adversary's genius to Renaissance reinterpretations to modern cinematic treatments, the Carthaginian commander emerged as the quintessential worthy opponent whose defeat only magnifies the victor's achievement. This cultural construction served multiple purposes across historical contexts. For Romans themselves, the existential threat posed by such an extraordinary opponent justified extreme measures taken in response, from human sacrifice after Cannae to the complete destruction of Carthage decades after the immediate danger had passed. For subsequent European powers with imperial ambitions, the narrative provided models for understanding encounters with civilized adversaries as distinguished from barbarian opponents. Literary treatments across centuries reveal this persistent fascination,